Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red tunic one final time, before stepping into position outside Buckingham Palace. The morning sun caught the gleam of his Victoria Cross, the highest military honor that hung proudly on his chest. 23 years of dedicated service had led to this moment, standing guard at the most prestigious post in the British Empire. The Victoria Cross wasn't just decoration for Morrison. He had earned it during a fierce battle in Afghanistan, where he single-handedly rescued 12 wounded soldiers from an enemy ambush. The citation read like something from a heroic novel, but the scars on his hands and the nightmares that still visited him were proof enough of its reality. His fellow guards looked up to him with genuine respect, and tourists often pointed at the distinguished medal that set him apart from the other sentries. Morrison's military record was spotless. He had served in 3 different theaters of war, earned commendations from superior officers, and never once received a disciplinary action. His dedication to duty was legendary among the palace staff. He arrived early, stayed late, and treated his role as protector of the royal family with the utmost seriousness. The morning started like any other. Morrison took his position at the palace gates, his bearskin hat perfectly aligned, his posture rigid and professional. Crowds of tourists gathered, snapping photos and marveling at the ceremony that had remained unchanged for centuries. Children pressed their faces against the iron railings, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous guards who never moved, never smiled, never broke their stoic composure. But something felt different that day. Morrison noticed unusual activity among the palace staff. Officials hurried back and forth with worried expressions, and there seemed to be more security personnel than normal. Radio chatter was more frequent, and he caught fragments of urgent conversations about schedule changes and unexpected arrivals. As the afternoon wore on, Morrison's commanding officer, Colonel Henderson, approached with a grave expression. The colonel was a fair man who had always treated Morrison with the respect his service record deserved. Henderson's face was tight with concern as he stopped just outside Morrison's line of sight. The conversation that followed would change everything. In a low voice that only Morrison could hear, Colonel Henderson delivered news that struck like lightning. There had been a complaint, he said. A serious allegation had been made against Morrison's conduct during his guard duty. The details were vague, but the colonel's tone suggested this was no minor infraction. Morrison's mind raced as he tried to understand what could have gone wrong. He had followed every protocol, maintained his position with unwavering discipline, and conducted himself with the same professionalism that had earned him his Victoria Cross. The accusation made no sense, but the colonel's expression made it clear that someone in authority was taking it very seriously. The colonel explained that pending a full investigation, Morrison would be temporarily removed from his prestigious post at the palace gates. The news hit Morrison like a physical blow. This position wasn't just a job, it was the culmination of his entire military career. To be removed, even temporarily, felt like losing a part of his identity. As Morrison was escorted away from his post, he caught the stares of his fellow guards. Some looked confused, others sympathetic, but all were clearly shocked to see their most decorated colleague being led away in what appeared to be disgrace. The tourists continued taking their photos, unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of a scandal that would soon rock the very foundations of the royal household. The walk through the palace corridors felt endless. Morrison had walked these same halls countless times with pride, knowing he was helping to protect centuries of British tradition. Now each step felt like a march toward an uncertain and troubling future. His Victoria Cross felt heavy on his chest, a reminder of the honor and duty that had guided his entire life. That evening, Morrison sat in his modest apartment, still wearing his uniform but feeling stripped of everything it represented. The medal that had once filled him with pride now seemed to mock him. How could a decorated war hero, a man who had risked his life for his country and comrades, suddenly find himself facing disgrace? The injustice of it all burned in his chest like acid. The phone calls began that night. Fellow soldiers, friends from his regiment, and family members who had heard whispers of his removal from duty. Morrison found himself having to explain a situation he didn't fully understand himself. The shame was overwhelming. Not just for himself, but for the embarrassment it might bring to the military tradition he had spent his life upholding. The investigation began immediately, and Morrison found himself assigned to mundane administrative duties in a basement office, far from the grandeur of the palace grounds. The contrast was jarring and humiliating. Instead of standing proudly in his ceremonial uniform, he now spent his days filing paperwork and answering phones in civilian clothes. The demotion felt like a dagger to his military pride. Details of the complaint slowly emerged through unofficial channels. A member of the public had allegedly witnessed Morrison behaving inappropriately while on duty. The specifics were unclear, but the allegations suggested unprofessional conduct that violated the strict code of behavior expected from royal guards. Morrison was baffled because he knew with absolute certainty that he had never wavered from his duties or acted in any way that could be construed as inappropriate. The military investigation was thorough and methodical. Officers interviewed witnesses, reviewed security footage, and examined every aspect of Morrison's recent service record. The process was designed to be fair, but Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that he was being treated as guilty until proven innocent. The presumption of innocence that should protect any soldier seemed to evaporate in the face of allegations against someone in such a high-profile position. Morrison's fellow guards were caught in an impossible situation. Many had served alongside him for years and knew his character intimately. They had witnessed his dedication, his professionalism, and his unwavering commitment to duty. But the military hierarchy demanded discretion, and speaking out in support of Morrison could be seen as undermining the investigation or challenging their superiors' judgment. The media began to take notice. Royal correspondents, always hungry for scandal involving the palace, started asking questions about changes in the guard rotation. Morrison's name hadn't been released publicly, but rumors spread through military circles like wildfire. The story was too juicy to ignore. A decorated war hero, a Victoria Cross recipient, suddenly removed from the most prestigious guard duty in the British military. As days turned into weeks, Morrison's reputation within the palace community began to suffer. Colleagues who once greeted him with respect and admiration now avoided eye contact in the corridors. The assumption seemed to be that where there's smoke, there must be fire. After all, why would such drastic action be taken against a decorated soldier unless there was substantial evidence of wrongdoing? The psychological toll was enormous. Morrison had built his entire adult identity around military service and personal honor. To have that identity suddenly called into question, to be treated with suspicion by the very institution he had served faithfully for over 2 decades, created a crisis of self-doubt that kept him awake at night. He began questioning not just the current situation, but every decision he had made throughout his military career. His family struggled to understand what was happening. Morrison's wife had always been proud to tell her friends that her husband was a Royal Guard, a Victoria Cross recipient who protected the monarch. Now she found herself fielding awkward questions from neighbors and dealing with the social embarrassment of her husband's mysterious fall from grace. Their teenage children began hearing whispers at school about their father's disgrace. The administrative work Morrison was assigned felt deliberately humiliating. Tasks that could have been completed by junior clerks were given to a man who had once commanded respect from soldiers and officers alike. He sorted through supply requisitions, updated inventory databases, and processed routine paperwork that had nothing to do with his skills, experience, or training. It felt like punishment designed to break his spirit. Colonel Henderson tried to maintain some level of professionalism in their interactions, but even he seemed uncomfortable with the situation. The colonel had served alongside Morrison in Afghanistan and had personally recommended him for the Victoria Cross. Now he found himself overseeing the investigation of a man whose courage he had witnessed firsthand. The awkwardness of their new relationship was palpable during their brief, formal meetings. Morrison began to realize that his case was becoming more than just a military matter. The palace household, always sensitive to public perception, was treating his situation as a potential scandal that needed to be managed carefully. The decision-making process seemed to involve not just military leadership but also civilian palace officials who were more concerned with protecting the institution's reputation than with ensuring justice for individual soldiers. The isolation was the worst part. Morrison had always been a social person, comfortable in the company of his fellow soldiers. Now he ate lunch alone, worked in a basement office away from everyone else, and went home each day feeling more disconnected from the military community that had been his life for over 2 decades. The camaraderie that had sustained him through difficult deployments and challenging assignments was gone. Some nights, Morrison would take out his Victoria Cross and stare at it for hours. The medal represented the best moment of his military career, the ultimate recognition of his courage and dedication, but now it felt tainted by current circumstances, as if the honor it represented was being called into question, along with his character and professionalism. 3 weeks into his exile from active guard duty, Morrison received unexpected news that would change everything. Colonel Henderson appeared at his basement office door with an expression that mixed urgency with something that might have been relief. The colonel's usually composed demeanor showed cracks of excitement that he was trying to suppress. King Charles III was making an unscheduled visit to the palace, Henderson explained. This wasn't unusual in itself, but the timing created an unexpected opportunity. His Majesty had specifically requested to meet with the guard who had been removed from duty. The king had heard about Morrison's situation through his private secretary and wanted to understand the circumstances personally. Morrison felt a mixture of terror and hope. Meeting the king under normal circumstances would have been the honor of a lifetime. Meeting him while under investigation for misconduct felt like walking into a courtroom where the judge held absolute power over his future. But there was also a glimmer of possibility that someone with real authority might finally listen to his side of the story. The preparation for the royal meeting was intense. Morrison was given permission to wear his ceremonial uniform again, complete with his Victoria Cross and other service medals. As he dressed in his quarters, he caught sight of himself in the mirror and remembered what it felt like to wear these honors with pride. The red tunic and bearskin hat transformed him back into the soldier he had always been, at least on the outside. Palace protocol officers briefed Morrison on the proper etiquette for addressing the king. Despite his years of service protecting the royal family, he had never actually spoken directly to any member of the monarchy. The guards were expected to be invisible, present but never presuming to engage in conversation unless specifically addressed. Now he would need to explain his situation clearly and respectfully, while maintaining the proper level of deference. The meeting was scheduled for late afternoon in the king's private study, a room Morrison had walked past hundreds of times but never entered. The study was smaller and more intimate than he had expected, filled with personal photographs, books, and artwork that revealed the king's private interests. It felt more like a comfortable living room than a formal royal chamber. When King Charles entered, Morrison snapped to attention with the precision that had been drilled into him through decades of military service. The king was dressed casually, but carried himself with the natural authority that comes from a lifetime of royal duty. His eyes immediately went to Morrison's Victoria Cross, and there was something in his expression that suggested genuine respect for what that medal represented. The king began the conversation by asking about Morrison's military service. He showed detailed knowledge of the Afghanistan campaign where Morrison had earned his Victoria Cross, asking specific questions about the battle and the soldiers Morrison had rescued. It became clear that His Majesty had done his homework and understood exactly what kind of man he was speaking with. Morrison found himself relaxing, despite the formal circumstances. The king's genuine interest in his military career, and his obvious respect for Morrison's service record, created an atmosphere of mutual regard. When the conversation turned to the current allegations, the king's tone became more serious but remained respectful and non-judgmental. The king explained that he had been briefed on the investigation but wanted to hear Morrison's perspective directly. Morrison seized the opportunity to tell his story honestly and completely. He described his confusion about the allegations, his certainty that he had never behaved inappropriately, and his devastation at being removed from the duty he had worked his entire career to achieve. As Morrison spoke, he could see the king processing the information carefully. His Majesty asked probing but fair questions, clearly trying to understand not just what had happened but also how the situation had been handled by the military hierarchy. There was something in the king's manner that suggested he was not entirely satisfied with how Morrison's case had been managed. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, far longer than anyone had expected. The king seemed genuinely concerned about ensuring that justice was done, and that a decorated soldier was treated with the respect his service record deserved. He asked detailed questions about the investigation process, the evidence that had been presented, and the support Morrison had received during this difficult period. Near the end of their meeting, the king made a statement that gave Morrison the first real hope he had felt in weeks. His Majesty expressed his personal commitment to ensuring that the investigation would be completed fairly and thoroughly, with proper consideration given to Morrison's exemplary service record and the lack of any previous disciplinary issues. The king also made it clear that he understood the broader implications of the case. The reputation of the Royal Guard as an institution depended on maintaining the highest standards of conduct, but it also depended on treating its members fairly when allegations arose. A decorated war hero deserved better than to be presumed guilty and exiled to administrative duties without a proper hearing. As the meeting concluded, the king shook Morrison's hand and looked him directly in the eyes. What he saw there seemed to reinforce his confidence in Morrison's character and integrity. The handshake lasted longer than protocol required, and Morrison felt that it carried a message of support that went beyond mere royal courtesy. The morning after his meeting with King Charles, Morrison arrived at his basement office to find Colonel Henderson waiting with a completely different demeanor than he had shown in recent weeks. The colonel's usual formal distance had been replaced by something approaching warmth, and there was an energy about him that suggested significant developments had occurred overnight. Within hours of the king's meeting with Morrison, the royal household had initiated its own independent review of the case. The king's private secretary had contacted military leadership, demanding a complete reassessment of the evidence and the investigation procedures that had been followed. This royal intervention carried weight that no military investigation could ignore. The independent review uncovered several disturbing facts about how Morrison's case had been handled. The original complaint had been vague and unsubstantiated, filed by someone who claimed to have witnessed inappropriate behavior, but could provide no specific details about when, where, or what exactly they had seen. More troubling was the discovery that security cameras covering the area where Morrison had been on duty showed no evidence of any misconduct whatsoever. Colonel Henderson explained that the investigation had been rushed and poorly managed from the beginning. The pressure to respond quickly to any complaint involving royal guards had led to hasty decisions that prioritized appearance over substance. Morrison had been removed from duty and demoted not because of solid evidence, but because officials feared the potential embarrassment of a scandal involving a highly visible palace guard. The security footage review was particularly revealing. Multiple camera angles showed Morrison maintaining perfect military bearing throughout his shifts, never moving from his position except when required by protocol, never interacting inappropriately with tourists or staff, and consistently demonstrating the professionalism expected of royal guards. The visual evidence completely contradicted the vague allegations that had been made against him. Investigators also discovered that the person who had filed the complaint had a history of making false accusations against public officials and military personnel. This individual had previously filed similar complaints against police officers, government workers, and other service members, none of which had resulted in any disciplinary action because they were found to be baseless. This crucial information had somehow been overlooked during the initial investigation. The revelation of these facts created embarrassment at multiple levels of military and palace hierarchy. Senior officers who had rushed to judgment found themselves having to explain why proper investigative procedures had not been followed. Palace officials realized they had allowed an exemplary soldier to be humiliated based on unsubstantiated allegations from an unreliable source. Morrison learned that King Charles had personally reviewed the security footage and the investigation files. His Majesty had been particularly concerned about the contrast between Morrison's exemplary service record and the hasty way he had been treated when allegations arose. The king understood that maintaining public confidence in royal security required both high standards and fair treatment of the soldiers who provided that security. The tide of opinion within the palace community began to shift dramatically. Colleagues who had avoided Morrison or treated him with suspicion now approached him with apologies and expressions of support. Word spread quickly through the military network that Morrison had been wrongly accused, and that the king himself had intervened to ensure justice was done. Colonel Henderson formally apologized to Morrison for the way the investigation had been conducted. He acknowledged that proper procedures had not been followed, and that Morrison's sterling reputation and service record should have provided better protection against hasty judgments. The colonel also revealed that he had personally argued for a more thorough investigation from the beginning, but had been overruled by superiors who wanted quick action. The psychological impact of this vindication was profound. Morrison had spent weeks questioning himself, wondering if he had somehow failed to live up to the standards he had always maintained. To learn that the allegations were not only false, but that the investigation itself had been flawed, provided enormous relief, but also raised questions about how such injustices could be prevented in the future. Morrison's family received the news with a mixture of joy and anger. His wife was relieved that her husband's reputation would be restored, but she was furious about the weeks of uncertainty and social embarrassment they had endured. Their children struggled to understand how their father, whom they had always seen as a hero, could have been treated so unfairly by the institution he had served with such dedication. The broader implications of Morrison's case became a topic of discussion at the highest levels of military leadership. The incident highlighted weaknesses in the procedures for handling complaints against high-profile service members and raised questions about the balance between rapid response to allegations and due process for the accused. Palace security officials began reviewing all procedures related to complaints against royal guards. The goal was to ensure that future allegations would be investigated thoroughly and fairly, with proper consideration given to service records and evidence, rather than rushing to judgment to avoid potential embarrassment. Morrison's case became a catalyst for broader reforms in how such situations would be handled. The formal reinstatement ceremony took place exactly 1 month after Morrison's initial removal from duty. King Charles had personally requested to be present for the occasion, making it clear that this was not just about correcting an administrative error, but about publicly restoring the honor of a decorated soldier who had been wrongly accused. The ceremony was held in the palace courtyard, where Morrison had originally stood guard with such pride. His fellow guards assembled in full ceremonial dress, creating an impressive display of military precision and tradition. The presence of the king himself elevated the occasion far beyond a routine administrative correction to something approaching a royal honor. Colonel Henderson, who had been deeply affected by his role in the initial injustice, spoke eloquently about Morrison's exemplary service record and the lessons learned from the mishandled investigation. His remarks served both as an official apology and as a commitment to ensuring that similar mistakes would not be made in the future. King Charles addressed the assembled guards directly, emphasizing the importance of both maintaining high standards and ensuring fair treatment for all service members. His Majesty spoke about the balance between protecting the institution and protecting the individuals who serve it with dedication and honor. The speech was widely interpreted as a broader statement about justice and due process in royal service. Morrison's Victoria Cross was prominently displayed during the ceremony, serving as a powerful reminder of the courage and dedication that had defined his military career. The medal seemed to shine brighter in the courtyard sunlight, no longer a source of painful irony, but once again a symbol of genuine honor earned through extraordinary service. The king personally handed Morrison his ceremonial weapon and badge of office, symbolically restoring him to his position as a royal guard. The moment was captured by official photographers, and would later become one of the most widely circulated images of King Charles's early reign, representing his commitment to justice and his respect for military service. Media coverage of Morrison's reinstatement was extensive and overwhelmingly positive. Royal correspondents, who had initially been interested in the scandal of a decorated guard's mysterious removal, now focused on the king's intervention and the ultimate triumph of justice. Morrison found himself portrayed as both victim and hero, a decorated soldier whose honor had been temporarily tarnished, but ultimately restored. The support from his fellow guards was overwhelming. Many approached Morrison privately to express their relief at his vindication and their respect for how he had handled the difficult weeks of investigation and uncertainty. The military community, which had initially been divided about the allegations, now rallied around Morrison as a symbol of resilience and integrity. Morrison's return to active duty was marked by a renewed sense of purpose and dedication. The experience of having his honor questioned and then restored had deepened his appreciation for the traditions and values he was sworn to protect. He understood more clearly than ever the precious nature of reputation and the importance of standing up for what is right. The administrative changes implemented as a result of Morrison's case were comprehensive and meaningful. New procedures required multiple levels of review before any decorated service member could be removed from duty based on complaints. Security footage and physical evidence would be reviewed immediately, and the credibility of complainants would be thoroughly investigated before any disciplinary action was taken. King Charles established a new position within the royal household, specifically responsible for ensuring fair treatment of military personnel. This ombudsman would have direct access to His Majesty and the authority to intervene when service members felt they were being treated unjustly. Morrison's case had demonstrated the need for such oversight and protection. The psychological healing process was gradual but genuine. Morrison had to work through the trauma of having his integrity questioned and his career nearly destroyed by false allegations. The support of his family, his fellow guards, and ultimately the king himself provided the foundation for rebuilding his confidence and sense of self-worth. Morrison's wife became an advocate for other military families facing similar challenges. She spoke publicly about the importance of supporting service members when they face allegations and the need for fair and thorough investigations. Her experience of standing by her husband during his darkest weeks resonated with other military spouses. The incident became a case study in military justice courses, used to teach future officers about the importance of due process and the dangers of rushing to judgment. Morrison's story demonstrated how quickly a distinguished career could be derailed by false allegations and poor investigation procedures, but also how justice could ultimately prevail when proper leadership intervened. Morrison began receiving letters from service members around the world who had faced similar challenges. His story had become symbolic of the broader struggle between institutional protection and individual justice. He found himself inadvertently becoming a spokesman for fair treatment of military personnel facing allegations. 6 months after his reinstatement, Morrison stood once again at his post outside Buckingham Palace, but he was no longer the same man who had been so mysteriously removed from duty. The experience had changed him in ways both subtle and profound, adding layers of wisdom and resilience to his already impressive character. His daily routine returned to its familiar rhythm, but Morrison now approached his duties with even greater awareness of their significance. Every tourist who photographed him, every child who stared in wonder at his uniform, every ceremony he participated in, carried deeper meaning. He understood viscerally how quickly honor could be questioned and how precious it was when restored. The relationship between Morrison and his fellow guards had evolved into something stronger than mere professional courtesy. They had witnessed his fall and redemption, and that shared experience created bonds of mutual respect and solidarity that went beyond rank or years of service. Morrison had become not just a colleague, but a symbol of integrity tested and proved. King Charles continued to take a personal interest in Morrison's well-being and career development. The king would occasionally ask about Morrison during his visits to the palace, and their brief interactions carried the warmth of mutual respect between men who had faced a crisis together and emerged with their honor intact. Morrison's story had reached far beyond the palace walls, inspiring military personnel throughout the Commonwealth. He received invitations to speak at military academies and veterans organizations, sharing his experience as a lesson in perseverance, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what is right even when facing overwhelming institutional pressure. The administrative reforms triggered by Morrison's case had been implemented across all branches of Royal Protection Services. New training programs educated officers about the importance of thorough investigation and the dangers of rushing to judgment. Morrison's name became associated with these reforms, ensuring that his temporary disgrace would ultimately serve a greater good. Morrison's Victoria Cross took on new significance as a result of his ordeal. The medal now represented not just his battlefield courage in Afghanistan, but also his moral courage in maintaining his integrity while facing false accusations. The cross seemed to carry the weight of two different types of heroism, both equally important to his identity as a soldier. His family had not only survived the crisis, but emerged stronger and more united. Morrison's children gained a deeper appreciation for their father's character, having witnessed his grace under pressure and his ultimate vindication. His wife became a stronger advocate for military families, using her experience to help others facing similar challenges. The individual who had made the false allegations against Morrison faced consequences for filing fraudulent complaints. Legal action was taken to prevent future harassment of military personnel, and Morrison's case helped establish precedents for protecting service members from malicious accusations. Morrison began mentoring younger guards, sharing not just technical knowledge about their duties, but wisdom about maintaining integrity in difficult circumstances. His office became an informal counseling center where guards could discuss challenges and concerns with someone who understood the pressures they faced. The media attention surrounding Morrison's case had positive long-term effects on public perception of royal guards. Instead of being seen merely as tourist attractions or ceremonial figures, they were recognized as real people with distinguished military careers who deserved respect and fair treatment. Morrison's story humanized the institution in important ways. King Charles's intervention in Morrison's case became part of his early legacy as monarch, demonstrating his commitment to justice and his respect for military service. Royal historians noted that His Majesty's willingness to personally involve himself in correcting an injustice reflected the values he intended to bring to his reign. Morrison's daily life settled into a new normal that incorporated lessons learned from his ordeal. He approached challenges with greater confidence, knowing that he had survived the worst crisis of his career and emerged with his honor intact. The experience had tested him in ways that battlefield combat never had, and he had passed that test. The tour groups that gathered daily to watch the changing of the guard had no idea that one of the soldiers they were photographing had become a symbol of justice and redemption within military circles. Morrison's story remained largely private, known primarily to those within the palace community and military leadership who understood its significance. As Morrison looked toward the future, he did so with a sense of purpose that extended beyond his individual career. His experience had shown him the importance of systemic fairness and the need for leaders who would stand up for their subordinates when justice required it. He began considering how he might contribute to these broader goals as his own career evolved. The sunset that marked the end of another day of guard duty cast long shadows across the palace courtyard. Morrison stood at attention, his Victoria Cross catching the fading light, a symbol of honor tested, tarnished, and ultimately restored to its full brilliance through the intervention of a king who understood that true leadership sometimes requires personal courage to correct institutional failures.